All right. So today is March 2nd, 2020. And we are going to be calling these notes energy flow in ecosystems. Energy flow in ecosystems. The first thing we're going to talk about is how organisms get their energy. All right, so we have a couple vocabulary terms. These notes are also going to cover all 20 vocabulary terms in your 9-0 packet. And so it's important that you know these terms for both the quiz tomorrow and for the test on Thursday. The first one is producers and consumers. All right, producers and consumers. What's the difference between them in regards to how they get their energy? Yeah, Johnny? Or do you know what one of them is?
Producers produce the energy and consumers consume it?
Yep, what does that mean? What does produce the energy and consume the energy? That's exactly what the word producer and consumer means, but what does it mean to produce or, yeah?
Producers make energy, consumers take in energy.
Yep, and how do you take in energy as a consumer? Eat. Yeah, so the consumers are going to eat others for food. So consumers are going to eat others for food, whereas producers are going to make their own food. They produce their own food. All right. You may have heard these terms. They're not exactly identical in the terms, but last chapter we called producers and consumers something else. Does anybody remember what we called them? Heterotrophs and autotrophs. Good. So producers are which one? Autotrophs. Remember, auto means self and troph means feed. So autotrophs are self-feeders. And heterotrophs means other feeders. Okay, so autotrophs and heterotrophs. So we've already kind of learned about these types of organisms last chapter, but this chapter we're calling them by a much more simplistic term. And remember, these terms aren't identical, but they're close enough for the level at which we're studying them. And so examples of producers. What's the most common example of producers that we're familiar with? Plants. Yeah, plants are producers. They use photosynthesis to turn sunlight into sugar. And then in the oceans, most of the photosynthesis is algae, and I'm not sure if I'm spelling it correctly, so I believe it's EA, but I could be wrong. It is AE. Thank you. AE. AE. Spelling is not my forte. It's not my strong suit. All right, and then aminals and fungi. Why did the mushroom get invited to the party?
You're the fun guy.
Yeah. You get it? I just remember this dad joke yesterday. I told it to my friends. We were sitting at the table eating fruit salad, and I go, "Why do melons have to get married in churches? Why do melons have to get married in churches?
I don't know.
Because they can't elope."
Cantaloupe?
Time to go.
But I need a soundboard that just does rim shots or like boos and hisses whenever things happen. All right, so the consumers that you guys need to know for the food webs, we have a list of them. So herbivores are an example of consumers, and what do herbivores eat? Yeah, herbivores eat those autotrophs, those producers that we just talked about. All right, we talked about carnivores. Those of you that speak Spanish or Latin as your primary language knows what carnivore means.
Carnivorous?
Yeah. What does carne mean? Meat, yeah. So carnivores means eat meat, and most of the time the meat, so basically it means animals. It doesn't have to be a big slab of juicy prime steak or anything. It could be insects. Okay. And then you have omnivores. What do omnivores eat? Now, omni means all, so they eat both. And then we did talk about these last time. We have decomposers. And what do decomposers eat? They eat everything, but specifically, yeah, eat waste and dead things. So when an animal's fur falls out or when you lose your dead skin, decomposers come along and they break it down while they eat it. So they don't only eat it, but they also break it down. We have decomposers on our skin right now, yeah. Luckily, our immune system is keeping them in check, but a lot of times when you get skin infections, what is happening is something's wrong with your immune system, or you're throwing it out of whack, and the decomposers are literally decomposing your skin a little bit while you are alive. So that's that irritation, that itchiness, that inflammation. Yeast is a big one. There's yeast all over your skin, and sometimes if you have an autoimmune disease or immune disorder, or you're just sick for other reasons, or you get a particularly virulent form of yeast, it'll start basically decomposing your skin while it's still attached to you. And that's what a yeast infection is. You can get it all over your body. Jock itch and athlete's foot are also both examples of decomposers on your skin, multiplying to the point in which, they're causing injury while you're still alive. They're decomposing you while you're still alive. All right. Next part is a food chain. Okay. What food chain shows is they show one possible way energy and or matter flow in an ecosystem. So food chains are showing only one possible way. Typically they start with, but they don't have to start with. Sometimes they will start with the sun. They don't always have to start with the sun, but sometimes they will start with the sun. So the sun is not always shown. But where does the sun give its energy to? What type of organism that we just talked about? Plants, which are known as what? Producers, yeah. So producers are the first, what is called the trophic level of the ecosystem. We'll talk about trophic levels in a second, but you have your producer. Okay. And then the thing that eats the producer all right, the thing that eats the don't try to figure out what it is. It's kind of a fictional animal. The thing that eats the producer, what organisms eat producers? Consumers. And the first consumer is called the primary consumer. The word primary, that word primary means first. So the first consumer after a plant, after a producer, is called the primary consumer. Okay? And then the thing that eats the primary consumer the thing that, my saber-toothed squirrel, the thing that eats the primary consumer, what do you think we call that? Secondary consumer, good. Okay. And then the thing that eats the secondary consumer, it's not always there. Most of the time it actually doesn't go this far, and we'll talk about why it doesn't go this far in a little bit. But all right, that is called the top consumer or top predator. Technically, it is the third consumer, and the third consumer is also known as the tertiary. But you don't need to know tertiary at all. I'm just putting it here because people asked last period. And so tertiary consumer, you can have quaternary consumers as well, but it doesn't typically go beyond 3 steps. And we'll talk about that in a while. It's rare to have 4 steps.
Aren't we top consumers?
We are top consumers because we very rarely get eaten by other organisms. Yeah. I mean, it happens, but it's rare. All right. So each step in a food chain is called a trophic level. And once again, troph means feed or to eat. So these are actually the feeding levels. So the feeding levels. So every step in this chain is called a feeding level. The sun doesn't count. So how many feeding levels are there in this food chain? 4. There's 4 feeding levels. There's 4 trophic levels. So this food chain has 4 trophic levels. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 trophic levels. Chains rarely go beyond 3 or 4 levels. All right, and here's why. Usually they're 3 or 4. There's very rare situations where you have 5. I don't know of any that are 6 levels, but it's due to the let's do the 10% rule. All right, it's a rule of thumb. It is not a hard and fast rule. It's not always exactly 10%. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. But what the 10% rule says is that only about 10% of the energy from each level is passed on. 90% is lost as heat or growing or keeping organisms alive or uneatable, eatable structures. Okay, so 90% of the energy at each feeding level is gone, and this is why food chains rarely go beyond 3 or 4 steps. Because every step you go, the amount of available energy decreases by 90%. The 10% rule. Okay, so when you go driving around or walking around, if you like hiking or anything along those lines, you go to a nearby forest preserve or you drive down around by a nearby forest preserve, what types of organisms do you see the most of? Do you see plants? Do you see herbivores? Or do you see carnivores and omnivores? You see plants. There's plants all over the nearby forest preserves, all over. That's all you see when you glance at the environment. Those environments are mostly producers because there's a lot of energy to make the producers from the suns. Now, if you spend some time in those, I know not everybody does, but if you spend some time in the forest preserves, what type of organisms are you most likely to encounter next? Carnivores or herbivores? Herbivores, right? You might see a squirrel. You might see a bird, a small bird. You might see a rabbit, if you're lucky, right? You'll see those more often. You'll probably see those 1 or 2 times through your hike. But what you won't see, what you will very rarely see, is a bobcat or a wolf or a coyote. You'll rarely see those. That's because there's less and less energy available to keep the higher levels alive, so there is less and less of those organisms. If you're like me and was nerdy when you were growing up and you watched like documentaries, nature documentaries, right? You see the zebras out on the plains of Africa, right? You see grass as far as the eye can see. And then you see hundreds and hundreds of zebras. So you got millions and millions of blades of grass, and then you got about 100 zebras. And those 100 zebras can only support maybe 4 or 5 lions. So as you go up the food chain, there's less and less energy available. So you get less and less of the organisms. So you have millions of blades of grass, hundreds of zebras, maybe 4 or 5 lions, maybe 10 tops. Right? Right. So let's do a sample calculation. Let's go back up to this food chain. So let's say the sun inputs a ton of energy, millions of watts, and that produces about 10,000 calories of plants. Okay? If I produced about 10,000 calories of plants, based on my 10% rule, 90% is lost, only 10% is passed on, how much energy would probably be in this next step? Divide by 10. What's 10,000 divided by 10? 1,000. So in my next level, there's only 1,000 available units of energy. Right? And then here, how many units of energy would there be available? 100, yep. And then here, how many units of energy would be available? 10. So what that means is in order to, let's say I needed 10 calories to keep this guy alive. That means I would need 10,000 calories of producers just to keep this guy alive. And if I don't have it, this guy dies. Right? So food chains are rarely that long. You need progressively more and more of these to support more and more of these. Okay. All right. Guys good on that?
I need the bottom.
In the bottom part? Okay.
What's that crossed out thing saying?
What's crossed out there?
There's or and then
Lost is heat or keeping organisms alive or uneatable structures, unedible structures. You got a question? You started to read something?
Could you shift out this sheet?
Okay, now we are going to talk about food webs. I'm going to draw a very simplified food web. I'm going to use 5 organisms in here, and they're all fake organisms, so you don't have to draw them the exact same way I am. All right, so I have this thing right here, this like blade of grass thing, that's organism A. Here I have organism B. All right, here I have organism C. Okay. Organism D. And then organism E. All right, so I have my 5 organisms there. They're very simple organisms. Let's say C eats A. Oh, wrong way. See, it's very common to make that mistake. I do it all the time. Arrow points to the eater, not the E10, because the energy goes from A to C. And then C also eats D. Okay? D eats A, and D eats B. E eats C and D. So what a food web is it shows many possible food chains. So example, in this simple food web right here, this one food web, how many food chains are there actually? Okay, here's one, B to D to E, there's one. Okay, tell me another one. A to C. C to E. Okay, there's this 2. A to D to C to E. And then there's one more. Oh, B to what?
no, A to D to E.
Oh, we also got this one here. We got A, B to D to C to E. Right? And then is there any more that I'm missing? I think this is it. I think there's 4. It's okay if we're missing one. We will have the right idea. So this is made of 4 different food webs. Or 4 different food chains. You got the green one, you got the blue one, you got the orange one, you got the yellow one, and there might be one more. Okay? So in this food web, you're going to be able to then figure out where are the producers, where are the consumers, where are the primary consumers, the secondary consumers, where are the omnivores, where are the herbivores. So let's start with the easy ones. Let's start down at the bottom. A and B, what are they? Are they consumers? Are they producers? Are they herbivores, carnivores? Yeah. A and B are both my producers. How do we know that they're producers? They're at the bottom, but they don't have to be at the bottom. They typically are, but they don't have to be. Yeah. Do they eat anything? No. So they are the producers because they do not eat anything. All right. D. What is D? D is an herbivore. Okay, D is an herbivore, which means that he is a consumer, right? What type of consumer is he? Is he the first consumer in his chain, or the second or the third? He's the first consumer. What do we call first consumers in the chains? Primary. This herbivore is the primary consumer. Okay. How about C? C is hard. First of all, what is he? Herbivore, omnivore, carnivore? He's a both, so that's what? Omnivore. Okay, so is he then a primary consumer or a secondary consumer or a top-level consumer? Second, primary?
Isn't he second? Because he eats stuff and then something eats him.
Okay. Before you start, first hour started like chant, like primary, secondary, primary, secondary. Before you start doing that, you're both right. Okay, C is both a primary consumer, right? Because you can go A to C, right? But he is also a secondary consumer. So you can be primary, secondary, tertiary. You can be those things all on the same food web. All right? You just have to look at the different chains. So if we go A to C, he's a primary consumer. But if we go A to D to C, or if we go B to D to C, he is a secondary consumer. So he can be both. Okay? And then how about organism CE? He's a secondary and a tertiary. Okay, so I'm not going to even write that down because you don't need to know tertiary. But he's secondary because of B, D, E, secondary. But he's also tertiary because of this way. He's also tertiary because of this way. And he's secondary because of this way. So he's a top consumer. And top consumers are typically what kind of vores? Carnivores. He eats an herbivore and he eats an omnivore. Therefore, he's eating animals. Therefore, he is a carnivore. All right, you will have a food web just like that on the quiz tomorrow. Okay, next thing I want to talk about is an ecological pyramid. They're also known as energy pyramids or biomass pyramids or lots of different things. What they do is they show the relative amount of energy organisms or biomass. We'll talk about what biomass is in a second. At each trophic level. Okay, so pyramids are what shape? Triangle or cones. Yep, I'm talking about if you're two-dimensional or three-dimensional. So I'm going to draw my pyramid here. I'm going to draw 4 different trophic levels. All right, And so this could show the number of organisms, it can show the number of energy, or it can show biomass, and I'll talk about what biomass is in a second. But what would have the most energy or the most biomass then? Which trophic level? The bottom one, right? So what level on our food chain has the most energy in it? Producers. So this is going to be my producers. All right. What would then my second row be? Primary consumers. My third row. And my top row. Okay, so notice as you go up the food chain, as you go up the food web, what happens to the amount of energy? Goes down. What happens to the number of organisms? Less and less. And so this is why, right, if you are a vegetarian, right, in order to keep you alive, you need a lot less producers. So you need a lot less land, a lot less things to keep you alive. Let's say you needed that much. But if you're a secondary consumer, right, not only do you have to keep yourself alive, but you have to keep all the things that you eat alive, right? And then all the things that they eat alive. And so you need a lot more energy to keep you alive if you are here at the top level, right? You need more grass because not only are producers, because not only do you have to eat the things that you eat, but you also have to include the things that they eat. So it's healthier for the planet to eat lower on this pyramid whenever possible. Eat less meat, less dairy, things like that. Because it takes less meat or less land, less water, less resources to make those producers and get the energy directly from the producers than it does take to get from the primary consumers. All right? Not saying you have to go 100% vegetarian, but it's also better for the environment if you eat less meat, not get rid of it altogether. All right, so that leads you to the question is, what is biomass? Biomass is the weight of living stuff. All right, so the producers are going to have, if I cut down all the grass on my African savanna and weighed all the grass, it would weigh more than weighing all the zebras. And that would weigh more than weighing all the lions, right? So the mass of the living stuff, the weight of the living stuff. Where does what areas of the planet tend to have the most amount of biomass? Okay, I'll give you the answer actually. The equator tends to have the most amount of biomass. It also tends to have the longest food chains. Why?
More biodiverse.
Nope, it has to do with more with what Elena said. And they're more biodiverse because of what Elena said as well. More biomass tends to be at the equator because more sun equals more what? More energy. More sun is more energy. All right, and that leads us to the last term that is on the quiz is consume able biomass. And the consumable biomass, not everything can be eaten or used. So this is the biomass that can be used by other organisms for material, for matter, and energy. And so what consumable means in this case is the eatable or edible, eatable. I know eatable is not really a word, but eatable biomass, the edible biomass. All right, and that's it for the notes. All right, I'll leave these up here for you guys to take photographs or pictures of, and then you guys can work with who you want to work on to get ahead.
What is that word? It says to be at.
Where? Oh, at the equator. At the equator. Because more sun equals more energy.